What is up, you guys? Diggerdan here, coming at you with another video. This time, doing book review on none other than Dracula himself. Ignore this corner. This is another one of those books I got secondhand, and as you know, if you've watched any of my previous videos before this, I love my secondhand books for the cheap. So without further ado, let's dig into it. So I wanted to read Dracula for years now, and I'm glad I finally did. This specific Spooktober. I would say ever since high school, because I know it was required reading for a lot of people. It wasn't for myself, or else I wouldn't be doing this book review right now on a recent read. And I know that Dracula is like iconic, classic horror vampire story, right? And it's just kind of on that whole nother tier where a lot of people think it's great, but it's old. Right? It was published in 1897, which I didn't realize until I already got the book and I picked it up and I started leafing through it when I decided this is what I wanted to read for my Spooktober read this year. And I'm glad I read it because, again, I know what happens now. I know the true origins of Professor Van Helsing, or Abraham Van Helsing. I didn't ever know his first name. Things like that. Because I remember growing up, watching the Van Helsing movie starring Hugh Jackman, and I thought that was really cool, and that you have this cool, badass vampire hunter, and if he's in this book, cool, I'm sold, right? I knew that was definitely a spin-off, watered-down version, or a lot of liberties taken of the original character, so I knew I wasn't really going to get that. Reading this, but that was one of the only things I knew about Dracula, aside from Dracula himself is this big scary vampire, right? That sucks your blood and can turn you into a vampire type thing. So those were the only things I knew going into it. So that's why I was excited to read it, but when I finally started reading it, and again, remembering that it was written over 100 some years ago, language was a little different back then. The way stories were told were a little different back then. So it was definitely slower paced than a lot of things I read today. And that being said, I don't mind slower paced, slow burn reads, because one of my favorite book series of all time that I'm currently reading is Wheel of Time. I'm on book number 11 out of the 14, or 15 if you include New Spring. And that one is definitely a slow burn. A lot of slow pay or long payoff moments, things like that. So again, I don't mind slow burn, but this one was to the point where I was bored to tears. Sometimes I had to put this book down a lot. Very similar to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I reviewed last video. You should go check that out. Where I forced myself to keep reading because I was interested in what was going to happen next. What are the story points? Some of the characters I did actually feel involved with, like emotionally attached to, which we'll talk later in a little bit. But yeah, non-spoiler, I'll just say overall 4.45. It's boring. If you really feel like you need to read the original to kind of get all the little tidbits, to part of the reason I read it, like I said, then I would say go ahead and read it, especially if you just get it from the library, or if you get it again secondhand from a thrift store or a book sale, things like that. But yeah, if you're like coming new into reading again, I wouldn't recommend this for you. So yeah, that's my unspoiler review. Now let's dig into full spoilers. So for those who haven't watched my videos before, the way I get my big grand scope of 4.45 is I have 5 categories I rate, and then out of 10, and then I take the average, so it's out of 50 total points, and divide that by 5 for a total overall score of 10. So the first category that I rate is emotional impact. That's basically how well did I feel about the story. Like if this is a horror, it's supposed to be a horror. Did I feel scared? Did I feel did I ever feel like the characters were in danger? Things like that. And for this one, I gave a 4 out of 10. And biggest reason is because I was just bored to tears a lot of times. There were moments where Dracula was this big menace, and I did feel like the characters were in danger. specifically like Lucy when she unfortunately passed and turned into a vampire. That was probably the most emotionally invested I was in. And then again when Jonathan Harker's, I think Mina is her name, Mina Harker, when they finally got married, when she got bitten by the Count, and then also when he forced her to drink his blood, and she was slowly transitioning into a vampire. That I did feel emotionally invested for her there as well. But there were a lot of other things that kind of took me away. Like a lot of times, ironically, like when Professor Van Helsing gave his big long monologues explaining his thought process or like what they should do next, I kind of just, I could just feel the pacing of the story kind of deflate. Like big long monologues, a lot of information, but it was him repeating himself a lot of times, which I just thought was kind of boring. And sometimes something that I thought was funny was like him keep saying, "Oh, my friend John," or "my friend, my friend, my friend." It's just him having to say, "You're my friend now," basically, like to Lord Galdring or something. He was the Lord. He was the one that was engaged to Lucy. Like they meet once or twice. He's like, "You're my friend now." Those things I thought was funny, but again, that's kind of cultural shift. I'm sure things I don't understand. But yeah, emotional impact 4. I was just mostly bored, I'll say. Next is characters. Overall, I did rate characters a 6 because like there were characters I did feel connected to and I was curious about keep going. Like Jonathan Harker, he was a badass. That first act of the book, I would say, maybe first 75 or 100 pages, where he's actually at Count Dracula or Dracula Castle Dracula, however you say that, and just him interacting with Dracula when he first gets there, not realizing that, hey, I'm talking to a vampire right now, and him thinking that Count Dracula is very high and sophisticated and very intelligent, which he is. But then as the story progresses, while he's still at Castle Dracula, and then he sees Count Dracula like climbing out of his window like a chameleon, he said, or a lizard, and like seeing weird things, and then he eventually does the same thing where he crawls into the middle of the day, Count Dracula's window, and goes down and then sees him laying in this coffin with or a box, really. It's never actually mentioned a coffin, but in a box on top of soil. Just weird things going on. And he was terrified, and he was doing things, and he was just, in this entire time, he's worried about Mina and getting back to Mina, and just wants to be with her and just wants to be home. And which I could relate to. That makes sense. I feel like that's a logical thing to want or to do. And then later, again, with Mina being very smart. Again, it was written in the 1800s, so with her being put down a lot by specifically like Professor Van Helsing, saying, "Oh, she's very intelligent or smart for a woman, or she has a man's brain." So some very misogynistic things that if were written today would be not cool. And it just being like accepted as, "Oh yeah, you're right. She's any man smarter than like the smartest woman" type thing, you know. So I just thought some things like that was funny. But yeah, character 6, because overall I did care about a couple of them. And Jonathan, the doctor from the lunatic house, the asylum, I can't remember his last name. Stewart, right? Or Stewart? Stewart, I think is what it is. He was really cool. Oh, and the Texan, of course. How could I forget about the Texan? Quincy, he was really cool. I don't know why he had to die there at the end. That seemed random, but I guess somebody had to die there. It was a horror. There wasn't enough blood and gore going on, I guess. But yeah, that was weird. Him just running past and then getting stabbed, and then he was the only one that got hurt, and then he couldn't help him. I don't know. That whole thing to me was weird at the end there. But yeah, anyway, I'm rambling. Characters 6. Plot, which is the third thing I rate, that was a 5.75 out of 10. So I did care about it a little bit, because like just dead average or dead neutral would be a 5. So I did like it a little bit. Again, I think just kind of the preconceived notions I had. I just really wanted to keep reading and see really what happened. But like I said, it was slow and boring at times. So I had to put it down a lot. But something that I did think was really interesting was that the book is written in diary entries by different characters. So you see different character point of views, depending on whose diary entry it is, which makes sense. So they're all talking in the past tense. So it's if they're writing a diary entry, then you know they survived at least until that point, right? So it kind of takes something like some of the scary out of it in some of those scenes, or some of those entries, but yeah. So I would say that was a cool thing that I think helped elevate a little bit. But yeah, the plot itself is kind of slow. And again, with just some of it was kind of forced, again, in monologues, specifically with Professor Van Helsing talking, saying, oh, this is the only logical explanation, and this is how I came to it. It's like, okay, anybody with half a brain could figure that out. Or some other things were just like pulling out of thin air. It's like, does that make sense? But then, again, some of those things were pushed forward by like Mina, for example, her knowing when the train station, or when the trains left the station to help John in his travel. Things like that made sense, but still maybe a little bit of a stretch. But yeah, plot 5.75. And then dialogue and prose, this is my least favorite thing, or the worst rated thing. I rated it a 2.5. Very low. This is the lowest I think I've rated anything. Could be wrong. Well, from any of the books I've rated, I'm talking about. Again, very, very slow. Very kind of oldie thing. It's not that I never misunderstood or didn't know what was going on. Because it was spelled out, and there were references in the back of the book, because it is the Penguin Classics edition. So there were, I don't really have a good example, but in the back there is appendix that kind of helped explain certain words. You can't even see that on the camera. I'm doing a terrible job. But so there were some things like phrases, or certain references that you'd have to be like an English person that lived in the 1890s at the time to really kind of understand. But thankfully it had the appendix that I could reference and be like, oh, this word means this. So that took a lot of that away, those issues. So it's not like I never really didn't understand what was going on. It's just that the way it was talked about or perceived, it was slow. It was, again, I was bored. The only reason I finished it, I wanted to put a stat book down. I wanted to DNF this book so many times. But the only reason I finished it, again, is because I told myself, I'm going to read this book. I want to know what happens in the original Dracula story. And I need to read something for spooky season, right? And I got like halfway through it, and I told my wife, I'm like, I want to not finish this book. I want to go back to Wheel of Time. That was maybe something that kind of hindered this book a little bit too, is I was excited to go back to Wheel of Time, because I picked this up in between book 10 and 11. She's like, no, you gotta finish Dracula. You promised yourself you're going to do it. You're going to kick yourself for not doing it later. I'm like, yeah, you're right. So I just put my nose to the grindstone, and a couple days later I finally finished it. I think it took me like almost 2 weeks, just because I could only do like 10 pages here, 10 pages there, and it's out of 400 pages, or no, 300, no, yeah, just under 400 pages. So if you do 10 pages a day, it's going to take you 40 days, right? So yeah, there were a couple times where I got like 100 pages. It was a grind, let me tell you that. So it was slow. But yeah, again, it's not because I didn't understand anything. So if you're worried about that and you still are interested in reading Dracula, don't be afraid of that. If you're an avid reader, I call myself like a semi-avid reader. I try to read as much as I can, but I'm not very quick. Then you'll be okay reading Dracula. especially if it is like Penguin Classics where they have the appendix and reference things. If it's just straight, I don't even know if it's like not Penguin Classics or something like that where it doesn't have the appendix to say, oh, this is what this means, then you might struggle a little bit more. But yeah, I think you'll be okay. So, and then finally, world building. I rated this a 4. Again, some of it I thought was interesting, like Castle Dracula, for example, and it kind of exploring bits of London and like where they actually were, and then them traveling the countries to get back to Castle Dracula there at the climax of the book. It was kind of cool, but again, kind of gothic-y vibe, or at least a little bit, at least in my mind, because it is horror, which I didn't care for as much. But yeah, 4. Kind of boring world building. Again, it's still like the world, it's still Earth, but just some of those like not mythical, well I guess mythical or fantastic, or fantasy, yeah I guess be fantastic elements weren't really there as much as I was thinking they were going to be. But I guess it kind of makes sense because it's like, how would the common man confront vampire, things like, I don't know. I just guess I was hoping for more of the vampire and more of the scary, which maybe back 100, 120 years ago, it was big scary, but this was like very low horror, at least in my opinion. I would honestly rate Relic, which was my very first video. You should go watch that. That is much higher horror than what Dracula is, at least in my humble opinion. So, yeah, that's how I feel. That's what I think. What do you guys think? How did you rate Dracula? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Were you kind of forced to read it in high school? Like I know a lot of people were. Like I think my older brother was, but he actually enjoyed it. And I recently told him I read Dracula and I forced myself and I didn't like it. He was surprised. Yeah. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys like this video, please hit like down below. If you guys want to see more from me, Diggerdan, please hit that subscribe button as well as that bell notification icon so you guys know when I upload each and every single time. And yeah, I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.